I'll give you a bit of an overview of what happens on in policy development, and that's about it. The introduction, I thought I should start with two quotes that I thought were significant. You have one from the European Commissioner, Hillenius. She is Dutch, just as I am. And when she was in 2008 the Commissioner for Competition, she started a battle within the Commission and within the EU on getting open standards introduced everywhere. And this is how she understands this problem of vendor lock-in and this problem of not being able to switch to competing alternative software solutions will be solved at the core. This is 2008, and Kroes is not afraid to challenge big software vendors, as you know. And she's probably not coming back after the current elections in May, so who knows who will replace her. And the other example is from a Dutch IT architect who works for the Dutch police force. They have they call it the Internet Forensics Department, and when there's a police force that goes to the crime scene where they take a lot of computers, so that they use VP or what have you, this is the unit that tries to take the evidence from those computer devices in such a way that it can be used in a court case. And these guys say, we can only use open source because we have to be able to audit the code, verify it, and make sure that this is the code that we're actually running on our computers. It all has to do with embedding it into the legal system. I'll give you the big trends. I'll give you lots of examples. Before I do that, I'd like to thank Red Hat and the Flock community for asking me here. I'm actually a Debian user, so don't beat me up. And a little bit about me. I already said twice that I'm an IT journalist, and I was very, very lucky enough to be found by the consortium in 2006 that was asked by the European Commission to start running what they call the Open Source Observatory and Repository, abbreviated OSOR. It's up there. And in 2012 this was brought into a somewhat larger project called Joiner. Both projects are very tiny projects with like little or no budget at the European Commission, which is a really big institute, and over 60 departments, 60 director generals, and they're all over the EU. And this is based on a server in Luxembourg, and it's about making public administrations understand sharing and reusing of software solutions in its widest sense. So it's open source, clearly. It's semantic assets where public administrations are trying to interoperate with one another. They discuss their dictionary for, say, password numbers and the French dictionary for password numbers, and they make a mapping. This is our number, this is your number, and this is how we translate those two. And those semantic assets are also uploaded and shared through this Joiner platform. The presentation is at Tom, so hopefully it will be shared through the Fedora website, and all the links are clickable. The big trends. Public administrations are increasingly turning to free and open source. It's really not an issue. When I started in 2007, most public administrations hadn't really heard of it. This might surprise you. And then all of a sudden in 2008, 2009, public administrations would put out a press release saying, we're actually moving to Apache something, or we're now using OpenOffice something. And then in 2009, 2010, this disappeared again. You will not find many public administrations in the EU doing a press release that mentions the word free software open source. But now if I call them, and I call them almost every day, they'll say, yeah, of course. And then I have to go and talk to their IT administrator, and they say, yeah, we use it for service, we use it for the document management system, we use it for the content management system. It's no longer a question. Though there are still a lot of areas where it's resistant, where there is resistance, and there are things that are not going well, as I'll try to show you. And the other big trend that I see is that there are more and more, especially young politicians, that are really digging open source because they use it. Most of them know, of course, without doubt, so yeah, Firefox. But you will also find, for example, these two MEPs that they have their Twitter handles. They actually use free and open source software on their desktops and their laptops. There's a very interesting pilot project going on in the European Parliament. They're trying to, they have 10 laptops, ThinkPads that are completely based on open source, and encryption is a big thing there. And they're trying to make this more popular among the MEPs, and they're interacting with the IT department that is resisting sometimes, and sometimes working with them. Personal things sometimes. You see this more and more. However, it's also one of the problems, as you will see later on. Free and open source software is really used for anything. It is very big. There's tons of public administration, so you'll find an example of anything if you look hard enough. But these are the undisputed territories: content management, document management, database applications, anything that has to do with electronic offering of e-government services to websites and so on. If you want to interact with your citizens electronically, it's very often done through open source tools. So again, it's not branded, it's not promoted by anything done with Gijs, Geographic Information Systems. Maybe you guys call it Gijs, I call it Gijs. Open data, very often based on CCAN. Many of the open data enthusiasts will privately say that this is also a way for them to promote open source and public administrations. It hesitant to say it out loud. Very much for software development, and it's used across all the sectors in the public administrations, not across all sectors in society. But at the Commission, these are all clickable headlines. I'll just open them all. I'm not going to open the browser. I'll just pick out two here that I thought were interesting. The first one is 200 ways to switch the EC directory to open source. It's a subtle reference to what Paul Simon had done. The Commission organizes exams every now and then for new staffers, and earlier this year they did an exam for 200 new IT staffers that they're looking to hire. And so 200 people participated, and one of the questions was, if you were asked to switch a department at one of the EU institutions, for example, the Joint Research Development Center near Rome, or maybe the European Institute in Patton that does nuclear research, how would you go about it? It's a change management topic. So now they have 200 recipes in their exam answers. And the other headline that is interesting is the EUPL and Cecile become compatible. Who here has heard of Cecile as a license? I see before I see
like French. The French ones.
Who here has heard of the EUPL? Okay, also identified. So the European Commission is doing a lot of open source development itself, though it's a bit shy about it. But they looked at all the licenses and they thought, if we're going to do this under the GPL, and if there ever is a problem, we need to fly our lawyers to the US to defend it in court about so carrying on. Also, it doesn't entirely fit with the European way of looking at copyright, so they had a bunch of lawyers, basically one from almost every member state, look at the GPL and try to tweak the language a bit so that it would fit more the European copyright system, and that it would actually, you can go to a European court anywhere in the EU territories. And they call that the EUPL, so it's the GPL for it. One other thing that I think is really nice about it is that they publish it in all the languages of the EU except for Gaelic. And they have made these through a ministerial declaration legally the same. So if you're a French software developer, you can use a French EUPL, and if you're a Maltese or a German or a Finnish or a Lithuanian software developer and you want to reuse that tool, you can just read the EUPL in your own language, and it will be legally the same as the German that was used originally. It's used, the previous slide was on EDC, it's used actually everywhere, so ministries, I'll quickly open these, I'm going to open the oops, they're a bit larger. French ministries, German ministries, they often recommend it when they don't use it themselves. The fact that I'm asking them the question makes them think of it. The interesting headline here is Finland's Ministry of Justice migrates to Open Office. This is already a few years back. Is anybody from Finland here? No, not yet. So they compared Microsoft Office, IBM's Office, and Open Office at the time. And they concluded that IBM's solution was financially the cheapest, but Open Office would give them most flexibility, so they went with that. And the CEO of the Ministry of Justice then went to university and did a PhD study on this, which is the most read PhD study of that university. In part because I started writing about the conclusions often. It's not my doing, but he was very happy with that. And he then went into retirement. He had already that age. But it's in ministries and in many municipalities. Really, everybody here will have heard of it. I will talk about it a bit later. Zaragoza, Bilbao, and Badajoz in Spain. Sierra del Niño in Portugal is interesting. It's a very small town municipality, but they've been using free and open source everywhere for over a decade without telling me. Of course, eventually I discovered it and we did a case study on them. And one of the things that I tried to do in my project is to compare these municipalities with their peers. And it's really very difficult because, for example, in the Portuguese case, they were loth to diverge the financial basis of their IT department. They were hesitant, so eventually that didn't work out. And so I couldn't compare them with, say, a municipality in the neighborhood that did not use as much free and open source, and I could maybe show how much cheaper or how much more expensive they would basically be. But this did work in the Dutch city of Ede, where, because there's a lot of auditing always being done in Dutch municipalities. And here we got our hands on the comparisons of the IT budgets of all municipalities in the Netherlands. And so we were able to compare this town with towns that are similar in size. And Ede, their strategy is as follows. They basically say all our applications should work through a web browser, and we standardize on Firefox, so we can use any which one. But our application service providers need to make sure that their applications work through Firefox, and that has helped them basically break open the market for their solutions, because it meant that all their suppliers started developing against Firefox. And if you compare the IT budget of this town with their peers, the difference is 92%, which is shockingly large. So Ede spends 92% less on software licenses than any of their peers. And there are many examples in the Czech Republic. I thought I should mention that it was a few years ago. There was a project by the European Regional Development Fund called OSEPA that brought to light a lot of Czech public administrations using free and open source in Jilava and in Bikov, and of course with Red Hat's presence here, it's probably going in the right direction. But you find examples in any country. It's happening in all sectors, in healthcare, as you see here in the headlines, in Riga, in Denmark, in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, and in Portugal. It's happening in education, though it's not as much as maybe I would like to see, but teachers usually see the value of teaching free and open source, as you can see in that quote from the Westcliff High School for Girls Academy. Where they realized if you want your pupils to start working for the next Google or to work at CERN, they'll need to know a bit about Linux. And so they've, over there, started moving all their PC labs to Linux and enjoy the freedom that it gives to the school kids. Right? The teacher there explained that they used to lock down all the desktops if they had proprietary systems. And now they just let it. The kids can do whatever they want. So the first week they're all changing from GNOME to KDE and they're changing all the colors and the fonts and whatever. And after a week it settles down and they find what they like and they stick with that. But it's really easy to manage. And this easy management is something that I find examples of all over the EU. Once you find a group of schools that discover free and open source software and start using it for their PC labs, for example, this Greek example, it was built by a few teachers in Greece. And it allows one teacher to manage a whole group of school kids working in this classroom and in that classroom, and they can just see what all the kids are doing on the desktops, of course. And they can show their desktop to all these kids' desktops, and it helps them to teach IT topics. It's also in defense. Maybe the Russian example is interesting. The government has decided a few years ago that they would switch they would start switching to open source in public administrations. And the day before that government announced it in public, two friends of the current leader of Russia decided to invest heavily in open source software suppliers, service suppliers. So it's always nice. But there are, I'm going to talk about 4 problems, but there actually are as many problems, so I should maybe mention a 5th one, but I didn't prepare a slide for it. But the first problem is, even though I said there are more politicians that are digging open source, there are not enough of them. When you talk to politicians and you ask them about about anything dealing with computers, their eyes glaze over and they quickly push you to the IT department because, oh dear, this is about my desktop, and if I change it, I can't do my work, and it's scary. So, and it's a pity because they should actually be able to phrase IT in terms of government spending, of responsible government, of sustainability, sustainable development. They should be able to recognize the values, the civic values that the government has, and map these to in terms of the free and open source communities. Openness, independence from IT vendors. And one of the interesting quotes up there is from the former CEO of the Basque country in the north of Spain, who realized that once you start doing open source, you're basically contributing to the public sector all the time. And it's a continuous loop. And he said, you can throw your IT costs across the pond into a US-based company, but then that's it, you spent it. If you put it into free software, it comes back to you, it comes back to society, and it creates its virtuous loop. And he used those terms to convince his government to start a free software policy. And in the Basque country, they're trying to methodologically replace all their software, their proprietary software by free and open source software. I keep calling it proprietary software, and I used to call it by name. And then I ran into problems with the IT vendors that had those names, and they started complaining with the commission, so then I stopped calling them by name and I just call it proprietary software. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. So the second problem is the desktop. It's the most visible part for maybe not for you, but for people in public administrations, and it's extremely hard to change this. There are a number of examples in Europe where public administrations ran into this wall where they tried to change the desktop and the users revolted and they came back. And they went back to the proprietary ubiquitous example. The European Commission, it's a very large institute, they admit themselves that they are locked in. They always come up with new excuses. One of the most recent excuses was that the LibreOffice and OpenOffice are not well versed in all the languages of the EU. But the project that I also, the same EC, the project that I work for proves that, and there is no European member state that doesn't use LibreOffice, so it is possible. And here it is a bit, they talk about free software and they like free software and they understand these principles. They are having trouble moving away from it, and they hope other public administrations actually move away from proprietary software so that they can do it as well. It's a bit of a do as I say, not as I do situation. That brings me immediately to the third problem, and that's procurement. Who of you have ever participated in a procurement bid, a public procurement bid? Okay, it's enough hands to know that it's an enormous headache, both for those who are formulating an offer and also for those that are formulating a request. But I'm not going to go into all the details of these headlines. You can click on it if you're interested in it. If you're really interested in it, there's a must-hear talk by a professor from Groningen, in the Netherlands, who did his PhD on open source and ICT procurement. And he looked very closely at how the European Commission itself is dealing with this. And the Commission is always harassed because it hasn't done public procurement for its desktop office solutions, let alone its desktop PC operating systems in the 20 years of existence. It's always a closed procedure, and they always say we want to deal with only you. And that's not public procurement. And they have always been looking for excuses because public procurement law actually forbids public administrations from doing this. So this PhD research, the professor concludes that the Commission is using two allowed excuses. Both of them are allowed individually, but they're not allowed in combination, and the Commission has to use the combination in order to get out of its public procurement headache. Now, they're being harassed by my project, and they're being harassed by a lot of other people that are interested in changing this equilibrium of it. And they are now promising that around 2017 they will publish for the first time in the registry a real tender based on functional requirements, and that others than the usual proprietary vendor can also enter. That's still a while away. And if you want to know all the details, there's a must-read. It's a case study that we did, which has all the gory details on how procurement is really ahead. But in short, it works like this. If you're doing a public procurement, you're not allowed to use a brand name or a specific solution. You're not supposed to say that I want him or I want Fedora, that you shall. Now, of course, most of them say we want Oracle or we want SAP or we want Microsoft. Those are the three names that you will come across, because there's people that look at the procurement and they basically count the number of specific references. And 1 in 5 procurement requests does that, so it's really a lot. And the Commission hopes to change it, but it's doing it itself, and it's showing other public administrations the loophole that they have found in the European procurement guidelines. So they need to clean up their act, and commissioners want them to clean up their act, but people at the Commission say, if you want me to run your IT department, then don't give me a headache about procurement because I have to change everything that you don't want, because then your civil service can't work. So it's an interesting conundrum. The fourth problem is that there are a lot of public administrations using free and open source, and there's a lot of them that develop such softwares. But the vast majority is really shy and unsure about how to do this. And they are shy and unsure about whether they can actually contribute to open source projects, whether they can make their code available as free and open source. And I love teaching them, I love calling them when I find that there's a project that they should have made open or that they are now legally required to make open, and it gets everybody in the public administration very confused what am I talking about. But it's a nice way to introduce the topic. But this was, my project really researched this. There were a lot of people that looked at this question, because the head of IT at the Commission, former head of IT at the Commission, wanted to make this more popular, and he wanted to make sure that all the developers that he has in his offices can contribute to open source projects such as LibreOffice or OpenOffice or what have you. And so this is what it boils down to. If you are a public administration, you own the IP to one of your software assets. You have the copyright to it. But you can just release it under whatever license you like. And I mentioned the EUPL before, but most public administrations in the EU actually publish stuff under the GPL, and not the EUPL. But it has all been dealt with. But now the former CEO of the Commission has left, and the new CEO, I think, hasn't read this yet. So every so many years you need to explain this again and again. And there are plenty of examples. This is the most recent one where the Dutch government funded a New Zealand developer who is already very active in Apache XCF, I think, to update something and make it available as open source. Because they realize that's it's the smartest way to deal with open source. It's the smartest way to deal with public money. It's public, so it stays public. Then I'll give you the top 3 of the most visible open source implementations in governments in the EU, and that has to do with desktops. So it's from biggest to small. The biggest is the French Gendarmerie. It's part of the Ministry of Defense in France. They have 72,000 Ubuntu desktops now. And the quote is there, the direct benefits of saving licenses, that's just the tip of the iceberg. What they really like is that it's so much easier to use and maintain. When they were working in their previous system, proprietary based, they had a France is not just in France, they also have hundreds of islands in French Polynesia off the coast of Australia, far away. They used to have a guy that would travel to French Polynesia by air, and they go from island to island by boat to update the system, to update the virus database, to update whatever. And he would come back and we give him a new set of CDs and he could read right away. They would never see the guy except when he was back to get a new CD. This they no longer need to do. Maybe it's a disadvantage if the guy loves his air miles and loves traveling to French Polynesia, but they no longer have to do it. And it's the French and Armory, it's part of the Ministry of Defense, and it's easier there. You just tell the guys, right, this is what you do. It's an order, you use this. And how did they switch to this system? One of the IT guys was at home messing around with open source, open office, I guess, in those days. And it did some of the functions that were required by his work. And the proprietary vendor heard of this and started complaining to his boss that, yeah, one of your colleagues, one of your minions is doing illegal stuff, he's using free software, it shouldn't be allowed. And this general said, hey, that's interesting. So he called his minion into his office and the guy said, well, look, it's free and it does the same thing, and it's free and it does the same thing. Ah, said the general, but then maybe we should do it across the board. So that's how it started. The second biggest example is the government of the autonomous region of Spain. So Spain has 17 autonomous regions. Extremadura, it's in the south on the border of Portugal. That first number isn't correct anymore, it's an old headline. 42,000 is what they wanted. 22,000 is what they'll settle on. They reasonably settle. The links are there. They have now 10,000 PCs in healthcare organizations in that region that are using Lingobex Salud, which is Spanish for health. It's basically Ubuntu or Debian with a few tweaks, and so it's a distribution that runs out of the box for healthcare organizations. They will eventually have 22,000 Lingobex desktops for their public administrations all across the region, and they already have 93,000 school PCs and laptops running Linux, which is also very heavy and it's tailored for use in schools. In Spain, you find hundreds of thousands of school kids using Linux almost every day. Also in Portugal, by the way. And maybe the most famous example is the city of Munich in Germany. Anybody from Munich? No hands? Okay. One hand. Great, welcome. They now have 14,800 Ubuntu Linux and LibreOffice implementations. They finished the project right before the elections. Well, the quote is there. The former mayor was not afraid to stand up, and when he looked, everybody here knows the details, but they were forced to upgrade from Windows NT to something new, and he said it's impossible to find an alternative, so let's go and really find an alternative. That's almost 10 years ago. So it took them 10 years to really methodologically move away from one system to a proprietary system to a free and open source based stack. But they had elections in May, and the new mayor and the deputy mayor are not so convinced, so who knows what the future will bring. It might change. There's a case study, it's this link on the OSR. You can read all about it. I promise you not only examples of implementation, but here's a few more things that are interesting. Sweden has a very interesting approach to making it easy for public administrations to switch to open source. They did a framework approach for procurement, so it saves all the municipalities and provinces from going through procurement. They can just use this model, and the model incorporates contracts, example contracts, and they have selected the biggest open source IT service provider, but also IT entrepreneurs individuals, so the biggest and the smallest. And you can go to these guys and say, look, under this contract, I want you to do this and this and this on the free software. So that's easy, makes it easier for them to switch. There's something else that is interesting in this framework approach that it deals with, it takes away the headache for public administrations that say, okay, so suppose we do free software and we fix the bug, what do we do with this code? Can we give it to the upstream project? Do we publish it ourselves? Do we start a GitHub repository? How do we do this? The framework says give this to the supplier that you contracted, it's their headache, but they have to make sure it goes upstream under the right copyright and under the right correct license. So, very well thought through. It's a model that should be followed by others. It's translated into German by the Swiss government. Don't get confused, this is the European Union. But it's in Sweden actually only used to procure standard packages. Red Hat this and Fedora.net and Alfresco, and it's not really much done for development. Another interesting example is in Norway, in the region around Oslo, the capital. There's a whole bunch of municipalities that are pooling their IT departments, that are developing solutions themselves, and they have, more or less coincidentally, started doing that with open source. And this you'll see all over the EU. Why is this particularly interesting? Because they are pushing it all through the web, and they're making it a cloud offering. So they're adding more municipalities that can just go to the local cloud of this host where in the region and use these. It's a help desk application, Redmine, and it's a survey application, and it's a teaching application. There's a whole bunch of them, but it's cloud. And the risk that I and others see here is that you cannot, as a public administration, distinguish anymore your involvement in a free software project from your involvement in the cloud thing, and the cloud could be anything. And if it doesn't really say open source, it might take away a bit the energy and the enthusiasm to contribute back to open source projects. Mm-hmm. Belgium is interesting. A country divided into regions that speak either German, French, or Dutch. There's a whole bunch, like several hundreds of small municipalities in the French-speaking region that are all developing their government services on the Python Zopi platform. France is interesting maybe because they want to be a little bit particular in the EU or particular in the world. They have a real open source culture. It's promoted at the government level, it's promoted at the ministries, promoted in municipalities. And the United Kingdom, I hope everybody in this room last month heard about the announcement that they will move to open document format as their document format. So those are just examples of how public administrations can tackle this topic. But not all is going in the right direction. Germany's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they had a guy who was very enthusiastic. He worked at the embassy in Chile. They had no IT budget. He had to do something. They needed to secure laptops. He took an open Linux, installed it on the laptop. It was secure. It was done. It costed no money. He started rolling it out through the whole organization. Eventually, once it reached Berlin, they ran into 5,000 users in the ministry there. They balked at switching from what they had to something different, and it was removed from almost everywhere. Freiburg, they ran into the same wall. IT department understood what they needed to do, but the users didn't want to. Politicians were not strong enough. They didn't stand up for it, so they reversed. The city of Mannheim, they tried. The CEO now said to me, I'm saying it here, I didn't write it down because he didn't want it to. He is breaking procurement rules in order to get where he wants. And he said, luckily nobody's ever called me. I said, but I didn't write it down because I didn't want to get into trouble. And as I said, Munich, it's Europe's most famous example, but it might, I don't know what the future will bring there. It's interesting. The Finnish city of Helsinki, IT department didn't, and still doesn't want to do what the council wants it to do. So, for instance, we have a majority in the council that says, look, at least start a pilot, or start looking at it, or do something. And the IT department says, no, we're not going to, because it will break this, it will break that, and then we have different problems. Something that I also find examples of all over the EU is administrations that ignore rules. And so we already talked about procurement rules, I already talked about procurement rules. But there are also governments that say, look, you need to support ODF. And this is used by many public administrations to switch to LibreOffice because it saves them a heck of a lot of money. And then they send this ODF to, for example, the EC or to their neighbors, the municipality next door, and they say, yeah, we can't open that. And then they called and say, look, there's the German saga, and it says you should use ODF, or there's the Dutch interoperability guideline, it says you should use ODF. But you shouldn't take that all too serious. Something. And one very interesting example is is Open Justitia. It's no longer a problem, so less easy. But this was a document management system developed specifically for the Swiss court by the IT department of the Swiss court. And they did exactly what the Swiss court wanted to do. And eventually, when it was more or less ready, they thought, hey, actually, we can just make this available as open source, right? So they did. And then a Swiss proprietary document management vendor took them to court, but they weren't in court, so they took the court to court. And to say this is unfair competition because you have a government and they shouldn't enter into this kind of development. And the court looked at itself and said, look, our document management system is like so different from yours that it's no comparison. So they threw it out. And but this is happening a bit more. The European Commission has published a procurement system helping public administrations to do their procurement, and it's running into something similar in Finland. One final example on sharing and reuse. We did a study on, we looked at all the legislation available in the 28 member states of the EU, and all the member states have policies that talk about sharing and reuse of software solutions, semantic assets, open source, open data, what have you. And they either do that by listing standards that you should use, or you should support if you are a government, or they actually have a policy that promotes sharing and reuse of software. Here are some of these examples. The first thing is the same as the previous slide. In Italy, in 2013, they famously adopted the law for digital public administrations that says you must go to open source if you have done a comparison and if open source wins the comparison. And then they did a commission to say how you do this comparison, but eventually this is running. In Spain, they have new government laws in 2007, which is really helping Spanish public administrations to make the case that actually the law requires them to compare proprietary and open source solutions, and if open source is better, they should move to open source. I already mentioned the Basque policy, which was accepted in July 2012. France's minister in September 2012 signed the IHO memorandum, is how I refer to it. That it's a very well developed policy on why free software, that's what they call it in France, why free software is important, why free software is useful, and why free software is beneficial for the government. It's not a law, it's a guideline, but it helps public administrations make the case. The Netherlands has a standardization board. They're basically adding new open standards to this list, and you can ask your public administration to make sure that they do this. And at the European Union, there is a digital agenda item, number 23, and it's against blocking, where they are trying to explain to procurement officers, use open standards because it does these nice things to your IT infrastructure. I'm almost at the end. I wasn't going to take an hour, but I can take questions. So the European Commission, over the past year, has studied this in many different ways, and these are two of their interesting conclusions. So many organizations, including themselves, are locked in. They really have no choice when they have to renew the contract after 4 years. They just have to go with what they had, because otherwise their system will stop working. But they also know how much it will cost if they don't change their behavior. And as I hope to have quickly shown you, it's not an easy thing to realize for public administrations. There are many disadvantages, many change management issues that they have to tackle. But they're working on it, and as I addressed at the beginning, the future is looking good, but it will be a long way. But you will see more and more free and open source software in public administrations across the EU. That's clear. Thanks very much. And if you have any questions?
failures or rollbacks of desktop, of implementations seem to be that users balked at the desktop. They were the new desktop. Is how you. Has there been any studies of what causes that?
So the question is that I listed here the failures, and most of these failures involve desktops that were experimented with, piloted, and then these were stopped or rolled back. There are no studies done into this, but it's really a change management issue. It has basically nothing to do with the IT. IT is never the problem, as you all well know. But it's the users that don't want to change, and they have a certain way of working, and you also will change their whole tool set, and that's it. And that's why I mentioned that there is a need for politicians that understand this, that support IT departments in this change management process. In Munich, I'll get to you in a second. In Munich, the IT department had to centralize 23 different parts of the city. And that, of course, already, this whole island made them 22 entities. And whenever they ran into a problem, they could take the problem into the mayor's office, and the mayor said, look, guys, we've looked at this, and this is why we're doing it, so make it so. And it really helped to have the mayor, the top dog in the city, defend this. And this, it's rare, actually. So, but no, there's no studies done in this specific. I'm trying to do it in this way. Yes, sir.
Just a quick remark on Munich. I want to say exactly the same, that it was more a problem of centralizing the whole processes and like the template management system they wrote. But you said you were not too optimistic about the future in Munich. After the desktops have been migrated, they are now migrating their firmware to Colab, and basically this is a long-term project for another 5 or 6 years, and we are involved in this. And from what I see in the tech department, maybe not the top political body, but what I see in the tech, from the technical perspective, we still have a lot of feedback, and we are not really worried about the future.
I'll try to summarize this. So you're saying that the political support is maybe wavering. It's only at the top level, only at the top level. It's the mayor and the deputy mayor. The city council has afterwards said, look, no doubt, and the deputy mayor doesn't know what he's talking about. And at the IT department, they're just full on. They're moving to Coda for group aware. That's true. And you also mentioned their document template project. I should stop here and mention a bit more, because they developed a document template management system called Hillenius, which is so good that the people in Freiburg, which moved back from LibreOffice, actually then said that we want to keep Hillenius, because it even helps them do complicated forms, and it makes it so easy that they really wanted to hang on to it. So it's one of the killer apps for public administrations, except that it doesn't work with Microsoft. So who knows what happens in Freiburg? And I'm not entirely pessimistic about what happens in Munich, but it's interesting. It's also interesting for the proprietary vendors to keep making sure that this stays a question. So we'll see.
Yeah, I could have a question along those lines. Like the 4 problems you mentioned, the biggest problem I see in the United States is whenever a government entity starts saying, we want to move to open formats, the lobbying comes in and basically derails it. And you kind of mentioned that the politicians may not be fully on board, but I'm wondering about how money in politics works in Europe, whether, when the government starts talking about it, Microsoft can come in, for example, and successfully lobby against things.
Yeah, I think it works the same way in Europe as it does in the US. So the Dutch police a few years ago installed LibreOffice, OpenOffice, LibreOffice and enforced that on their laptops, and when the Microsoft guys came to negotiate, and they dropped the price, so that was already one way. This is what basically a lot of IT people do when they want to negotiate with one of the proprietary vendors. They just install the open source alternative. The greater London Authority is also the same example. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And in some cases they can get it for free. So yeah, this happens.
I'm talking more about lobbying at the
Yeah, lobbying happens as well.
legislative level.
There's an enormous amount of fun being spread not too long ago, people in the IT department of the Commission were convinced that Munich had rolled back. Until I asked, but who told you that? And they went, oh, hang on. I know who told me that, of course. So, yeah, it happens, yes, of course. Yes, sir.
Why do you think all three of your top three are Ubuntu desktop rollouts? And follow on, what do you think we could do to change that as Fedora people?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I don't think there's that much difference. And I think you'll see people switching from one to the other distributions more soon. But that's my optimistic view.
Do you think it has anything to do with there being a corporate entity behind the Ubuntu desktop?
Yes, it will certainly help. But none of these three actually have contracts with Hillenius, but the other ones don't. Yeah, it's all those things. They look at long term, they look at it, can we get commercial support? How well does it look?
So I know of a few cases of public administrations in Spain, universities for example, where they know they're locked in by Oracle, for example. They have budgetary issues that prevent them from implementing the migration, so they're unable to basically save the money because they have to spend it because they don't have the money to.
Yes.
So do you have any programs to help them, or does the EU have any programs to help them?
So the question, the remark is, and this is true, public administrations that run into budget problems then don't have the budget to change, to get out of the budget problem. Because you need to invest in order to get out of the budget problem. And this happens, and this is a big block to public administration that say, oh, let's move to this cheaper, or at least more flexible, or both system, and then we don't have the money to do that. I've recorded that a few times, and you say Spain, it's a few times where people have said it also to me. And the Commission, no, doesn't have big pockets to do that. The European Regional Development Fund sometimes will be able to help you. But that's not how the EU works, right? It's not. They try to promote awareness, and that's one of the things that this project is trying to do. But there's no funds available for changing that. No. I mentioned the European Regional Development Fund. It's interesting to see one of the mechanisms there. I mentioned procurement, and the European Regional Development Fund looks at procurement when it evaluates projects. So, for example, in Poland, there is a group that follows public administration's procurement procedures, and they sometimes write little protest letters, and I pick up on those. I use Google Translate to read Polish, and then I write about it, and I call the European Regional Development Fund and I said, hey, the fire department in Poland is doing this rollout, and in their requirement, they actually say, Oracle, that's not allowed. How are you going to finance this? Well, thank you for mentioning it to us. We'll just put a little remark in there. Don't shame. When they send us the invoice, we'll tell them that they didn't do the European procurement rules, and we might not be able to fund their proposal. So that really sent a bit of a shock to Poland to help them clean up their procurement. That's a nice one. So much fun. Any other questions? One more question.
It was called the EGPL or EUPL?
EUPL, original name. It's very popular in the Commission. Outside it's not.
And could you spell that document management system real quick?
Which one?
The one in from Munich?
Walnux. The eierlegende Walnux. WOLLNUX.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope the slides will be up, and I hope to see your comments in the articles. Thank you.